Wu Sun was annoyed by such worthless whips he got from the system, so he asked Spirit if the system couldn't be more serious and give him normal improvements instead of this mockery. But Ruhua was determined to convince his little master that the system is always completely serious and this is the way of gradual evolution. Our protagonist realized that there was no point in arguing with him and he was just too lazy to deal with him. So he simply told him to disappear from his sight and not to annoy him. After getting rid of the annoying system Spirit, he turned his attention to his new friend and decided to offer him a mutually beneficial deal. Since he had helped the gecko escape from the big frog and the gecko had offered him food and gratitude, it meant that the little creatures knew how to be grateful. And he planned to use that to his own advantage. Wu Sun offered the gecko a deal, saying that in the future if there was any threat he could just come to him and he would protect him. In exchange for just one condition, he would have to catch a bug for him every day. He thought to himself that this would be a brilliant move since he couldn't move and his whips had a limited radius, but with a mobile partner to help him catch bugs he could level up very quickly. The gecko didn't seem to be at all thrilled with this offer and looked at him incredulously. Wu Sun began to justify that bringing him bugs would not only benefit him but also the gecko, because by raising his level faster he would also be able to provide more security for him. The gecko seemed to be satisfied with this explanation and no longer looked at him so disgruntled. He seemed to agree to his terms. Wu Sun exhaled a sigh of relief and assured him that since they had agreed, he would not let him down. Then he asked the gecko if he could call him Little Yellow. He didn't seem at all thrilled at this idea. Seeing his expression, Wu Sun was indignant and asked what was wrong with his appearance. Doesn't he like his new name? He had to blame his poop-colored appearance for everything. Whatever, back in the day he was a top student in high school rocket class. And now when he gave him a name how could he complaining? A few days later. After accumulating enough evolution points and eating another bug, he was able to open the box from which he got the B-rank plant gene, Tsang-er. Fuse location for this gene was seed and then system asked if he wanted to fuse. This gene is taken from an annual herb Asteraceae family. The seeds of this plant have hooked thorns that could attach to passing animals' bodies. Wu Sun was happy that with the help of his little yellow mascot he was able to unlock the new plant gene in a few days. But he still wondered how he would be able to use this gene after the fusion if it was in the seeds. At his command a system spirit appeared and immediately helped him to make the gene fusion. The fusion was successful and the system congratulated him for obtaining the new gene. Now he could throw spiky Tsang-er and give his opponents a full body massage. And also the refreshing taste of his seeds would be unforgettable. The system warned him to be careful when talking to his friends and opponents so as not to accidentally throw a bunch of spikes at their face. However, when he heard the place where the spiky seeds would appear from, our hero was not at all thrilled about the whole thing. He asked the service spirit if these seeds would cut his throat. The Ruhua service spirit didn't seem to be in a hurry to answer his question and instead picked his nose. Finally retrieving some gold from there, he immediately threw it at the irritated Wu Sun's head. Ruhua despite his actions called him his little master and assured him that everything would be fine. All he had to do was open his mouth a bit wider and make a retching sound and all seeds came out. It's as simple as picking nose. Wu Sun decided to try and unpleasant sounds filled the clearing. In the end he was able to spit out a lot of thorny seeds. After that, he immediately coughed and through his coughing began to reproach the spirit how he could betray his trust. Although it's not the intense pain of a cut throat but his throat felt scorched from the scratching. The spirit nonchalantly replied to him that great power comes at a high price, little master. He advised him to ignore the sore throat and give the power of Tsang-er a try. In the end he had no choice but to learn how to use this power so he decided to touch the seeds with one of his vines. It turned out that even though these Tsang-er looked quite sharp, he found out that he felt no pain from them when he touched them with his vine. Surprisingly it doesn't hurt and that was because his vines became tough and thick after upgrading. And in that case he could afford to let his creativity run wild and realize some of his bold ideas. He'd already figured out how to amuse himself with the seeds. To do this, he gave the gecko a dry leaf and asked him to stand away. The gecko took the dry leaf in his paws and looked at him questioningly not understanding what he should do with it. But Wu Sun hurried him up and asked him why he was standing there like a log. But seeing the gecko's incredulous gaze, he had to convince him not to worry, because he would definitely not fool him. When the gecko had gotten far enough away, our protagonist told him to stop and stand there. He cheerfully announced, "Watch this, here comes a little flying whip." And he threw the spike, aiming for the dry leaf in the gecko's clutches. But he didn't hit what he was aiming for, and instead of a leaf, he shot the gecko's tail off again. The gecko didn't even realize what had happened. The gecko only noticed that something was wrong when pieces of its tail began to wriggle behind it. Wu Sun realized that he had done something wrong and apologized, assuring the poor gecko that it was not on purpose. But his apology couldn't bring the poor thing's tail back, and he was showing it very clearly with his look. His look pissed off our hero, who shouted furiously to him, "What's with that contemptuous look? How he dared to look down like that on his big brother." Then he immediately decided to correct himself and try again, being sure that it was only an accidental mistake and now he would succeed. And to everyone's surprise, he hit the leaf. But not the one he was aiming at. Gekken realized that he was hopeless and it was only a matter of time before something else got shot off. It turned out that all the thorny seeds he had thrown were nowhere near the target and had hit all the bushes with the accuracy of a sniper, leaving them no chance. For such outstanding services, Wu Sun definitely deserved to be rewarded with the Lizard Body Outlining Master medal. But he did not give up, reassuring himself that just today his accuracy was a bit off. But that was okay, because with diligent practice he will surely improve his throwing skills and become a ninja master at accuracy. Gecko continued to hunt bugs, terrorizing the local arthropod fauna. And judging by the number of insects in his mouth, he was very successful at it. Having finished the hunt, he began to make a hole in the withered tree inside the trunk of which rainwater was collecting. And when the hole was ready and dirty water was pouring out of it, the gecko began to pour it into a bowl. The poor fellow was sweating from the continuous work, but still he hurried to his friend Flower. While the gecko was working hard, he was just basking in the sun and catching bugs. Talking about his hard life and complaining that Little Yellow was delayed. He was hungry and didn't understand why he still felt hungry after being a plant. But as soon as he heard a noise from the bushes, he immediately put all his thoughts aside. When he saw a gecko with a bowl in his paws, he thought that as soon as he spoke of the devil, he would immediately appear. But all his resentment was taken away when the gecko gave him a bowl of water and even filled his mouth with water and showered him with an improvised rain. Wu Sun praised Little Yellow, telling him that he is smart, learns quickly and even knows how to use a bowl for water. But it seems that all his cleverness did not extend to how to transport the bugs, because he kept them in his salivating mouth, and when he spit them out on the ground in front of our Flower, they were completely covered with saliva. So Wu Sun advised him to find some tree bark next time he catches bugs and put them there, it would be much more hygienic than that. But this time he was hungry enough to ignore a little thing like drool and started eating the bugs. After devouring a few bugs, the ugly system spirit reappeared in front of him and congratulated him on getting another chest for eating green-headed fly. This chest needed 10,000 evolution points to open as always, and Ruhua asked him if he wanted to open it now. But Wu Sun decided to save it for later. Right now he didn't want new upgrades since he hadn't learned how to use Tsang Air properly yet. And on top of that, the ground under the scorching sun had become too dry, so he had to ask Little Yellow to fetch some water to help him grow more vigorously. Sipping water and juggling his thorny seeds, Wu Sun enjoyed his life and even said that this is the laid-back life he wanted and it feels good to have someone who feeds him. After finishing his water, he decided to try his hand at throwing thorns again. But even though this time the gecko held 3 leaves at once, he still didn't hit. Even the massive volley that followed didn't help, and he didn't hit once again. Just reaffirmed the title of the most accurate marksman in the Wild West, and he didn't hit once. But that didn't seem to spoil his mood, because he had enough time and bug snacks to keep practicing. So he ordered his Little Yellow friend to collect and bring him all the Tsang Air. Wu Sun didn't even realize that he was under close surveillance. His arch-nemesis who had come for revenge was a big bullfrog. It was waiting for the right moment to attack an unsuspecting victim, which was a gecko who went to collect the Tsang Air scattered around the clearing. When he had already collected everything and was about to leave, the toad suddenly jumped out of the bushes. Even Wu Sun's shouts to the gecko to be careful didn't help. And the toad with its long sticky tongue embraced the poor gecko, who could do nothing. Our flower could only watch his little yellow friend disappear into the frog's bottomless mouth. When it closed its jaws, it already seemed that the unenviable fate of the gecko had come to an end. Wu Sun couldn't believe that his friend had died so quickly. He cried out desperately and violently, "Little Yellow," while still trying to reach the toad with his whips. The gecko's situation was not enviable. He was still alive, but inside the toad he wouldn't be able to stay that way for long. The poor thing was trapped inside the giant's stomach, which was clenching every now and then. But he still hadn't released the spiny seeds from his paws. And that gave him hope of escape. Showing all his ingenuity, he took a few thorns in his paws and began to actively stab the toad from the inside with them. The toad's eyes widened with pain. The first time it had eaten its victim it was struggling so hard in its stomach. It couldn't take the pain any longer and began to prepare to spit out its spiny lunch. The toad spat out the entire contents of its stomach along with the gecko and streams of vile slime. Wu Sun had already said goodbye to his friend and was surprised to see him again. He was at a loss as to why the toad had spit him out. Did his taste as bad as his poop-colored appearance? With one swipe of its paw, the toad threw its stinky and prickly prey away from its tongue. Wu Sun, seeing all this, remembered how he had once seen an online video of a toad swallowing a farting bug and then spitting it out. So when toads eat something poisonous they regurgitate their stomach to clean it. In the end he happily concluded that it was because Little Yellow was holding the tsang air in his paws. So he hurried the gecko back to him with the prickly seeds. But because he was holding the seeds in his front paws, his speed was very slow. And the toad had already managed to gulp back its stomach. And the toad's eyes lit up with rage and annoyance at the fact that its prey was leaving right under its nose. The toad couldn't just let it go and jumped again with its mouth wide open, about to swallow the unfortunate gecko again. But because of this jump it got within range of our flower's whips. And he spread his whips and asked the toad how she dared to come again. Doesn't she remember how it ended last time? This time, having two whips at once, he would not let her leave alive. The toad appeared to be ready for the first attack and dodged it. It even managed to grab one of the whips, just like last time. And tried to reach her tongue into the flower to finally pluck it out of the ground. Well, something didn't go according to plan. After all, the flower's vines were now too long, longer than the toad's tongue, and it just couldn't reach it. Wu Sun only laughed at her pathetic attempts and asked her what she was hoping for trying the same move against him second time. Hadn't she noticed the change? Our flower's vines were now longer, thicker and stronger. And were already beginning to entangle the helpless toad. After tying her up tighter, he began to pull her towards him. The poor thing resisted as much as it could and struggled with all its might, but its fate was already decided. Because bound she was completely in the power of our flower, and now he could easily lift her into the air, depriving her of any support under her feet. And then with such force to land her back on the ground head downward at the stony soil scattered in all directions. From such a blow, the toad's eyes darkened and she lost consciousness. Seeing how frozen the toad was, Wu Sun smugly advised it, "Don't think I can't handle you just because you're petrified." He also decided to ask her a math problem to tell her that if he spit out 5 tsang air every day, how many tsang air will he have spat out in total after 10 days? The answer was nearby where a pile of his spiky seeds were stacked. Expectedly, without waiting for a response from the toad, he wrapped his arms around it. And sent it flying straight toward the pile of thorns. He slammed it into the thorn pile once. It seemed that his rage for all his suffering was overwhelming him because he didn't stop there and kept hitting the poor toad again and again. Even the gecko was shocked by this cruelty and nervously imagined that he could have been in her shoes if he hadn't befriended this crazy flower. Wu Sun finally calmed down only when the entire clearing was covered in clouds of dust and the toad was no longer showing any signs of life, looking more like a chop. He ironically asked it, not bouncing back this time. After such a beating, it wasn't hard for the flower to cut up the dead toad. And as he separated the toad's leg, he smugly praised himself for defeating such a large opponent. As it turned out, he hadn't expected his thorny seeds to help him handslay enemies. Otherwise he couldn't have swallowed such a big one. Wu Sun was not greedy and decided to share a piece of his victory with his shocked little friend. But seeing his indecision, he had to tell him, "Come on buddy, you should share with me the fortune and misfortune, so let's eat together." Hearing this, the joyful gecko immediately pounced on the food. Wu Sun also started eating and had to admit that the toad tastes pretty good. But he wondered if the system would give him a chest for eating the toad in pieces, since the last time he ate a piece of the gecko's tail he didn't get anything. But he didn't have to guess for long, as the next moment, a disgusting system spirit appeared with 2 chests. Wu Sun did not pay attention to the appearance of the spirit, but was only happy to receive 2 chests at once. He had a logical question: why didn't he get any when he swallowed the gecko tail last time? And when he ate just 1 piece of the big toad now, did he get 2 chests at once? Ruhua, looking at the gecko eating the meat with such gusto, didn't seem to be sure why the flower was so lucky. So he answered him in no uncertain terms that apparently the system considered killing the big creature and eating the first bite to be a sufficient condition for getting the chests. But in general the rules for getting chests were a bit different. For small creatures that the host can swallow in 1 bite there is a 100% chance of getting a box. As for larger creatures that require a chewing, there's a chance of getting a box with each bite. However, all of this also depends on luck. If luck is bad, even if the host eats a whole toad bursting the stomach, it might only yield 1 box. After hearing all these explanations, Wu Sun decided to continue eating the toad, and literally after the next bite he got the chest again. Ruhua was not at all pleased with such luck of our hero. And Wu Sun was just glowing with happiness and anticipation of what he could get from them. And now he smugly asked if the fact that he had gotten so many chests meant that his luck was extremely good. After all, he had gotten 3 boxes in just 3 bites. System Spirit Ruhua merely grudgingly hummed in response and not at all sincerely wished him luck in the next bites. Wu Sun didn't understand what he meant, but sensed that he didn't want anything good for him really. And advised him to look at his ugliness instead of making caustic remarks. After a little while, our flower and the gecko had had enough and couldn't sit down to another bite. However, in all this time, our flower didn't get any more chests. Which of course made him very angry, and he blamed everything on that nasty system spirit, who could have done all this on purpose. For since he said that sentence earlier, not even bursting his stomach resulted in a chest. But Ruhua, picking his nose, had no problem justifying himself by saying that it was just a problem with his luck and there was nothing he could do about that moody lady luck. Lastly, he asked if he wanted to open the chests now. Wu Sun refused on the grounds that he wasn't interested in opening the chests at all, as he had so much left to eat right now. Despite his and Gecko's best efforts, they were only able to eat half of the toad, which was already an achievement considering their size. But something had to be done with the other half, because if it wasn't dealt with properly, such a big chunk of meat would surely attract carnivores, who could easily destroy our flower with a single swipe of their paws. But Wu Sun was not stupid, and in his head came up with a brilliant idea how to deal with the carcass and at the same time get the most out of it. Since it could not only eat through its mouth, the protagonist decided that a great idea would be to bury the body, thus turning it into organic fertilizer, which would allow him to absorb nutrients little by little through the roots without any competition. Ever since he was a kid, he remembered his mom burying meat or fish in the ground. And to his curious questions about why she did it, she answered that microorganisms in the soil decompose the bodies of dead fish into carbon dioxide, water and inorganic substances. And it was these that were absorbed by the fruit trees, so that they grew faster and gave more tasty crops. However, the protagonist had a problem: his vines were not designed to dig into the ground at all. After thinking about it, he realized that he could solve this problem quite easily if he could find tools that he could wrap around the vines. However, the second problem was that shovel-like digging tools were unlikely to be found here. His only salvation was his yellow friend, whom he immediately asked to find thick branches and scaly rocks for him. He folded his vines into roughly the shape he wanted and showed them to the gecko, who stared at them intently. After a few minutes, the gecko turned around and headed somewhere. As he stared at the gecko, the protagonist could only hope that he understood what he wanted. After a while, several branches of different thicknesses and a small stone were lying on the ground in front of him. The gecko who had brought it all was looking at him happily, as if expecting praise. However, Wu Sun didn't really appreciate his efforts. Easily breaking the branches with his vines, he said that these branches were not suitable as they were very thin and would break very easily. Picking up some ground with his leaf, he added that the soil here was very soft, so he needed something thin and strong. After a moment of silent staring at the broken branches, Gecko seemed to understand what he wanted from him, nodded his head and rushed off. However, he did not manage to bring the necessary tools the first time. He brought a leaf and a lump of mud, which were obviously not solid. Even though he was tired, he brought a huge log that Wu Sun didn't know what to do with because he could hardly move it. However, this was not what he needed, and he even thought that he had overestimated the IQ of his yellow friend. Suddenly, however, two objects fell to the ground in front of him, a sharpened bone as well as a broken arrowhead. His eyes immediately widened with surprise. After grabbing the arrow, he was very happy with it, because even though it was broken and rusty, it was still what he needed. It was also made of iron, which could mean that there were other intelligent beings in this continent who knew how to use tools. Grabbing the bone and arrowhead with his vines, he immediately got into a threatening fighting stance, saying that these two sharp objects could be good weapons for him. And if he was attacked by a toad again, he would be able to slit its belly easily. Praising the gecko for finding what he needed, he tossed him the bone and added that they had some work to do. They started digging together. After a while a rather large hole appeared in the ground. Wiping sweat with a vine, Wu Sun turned to the same tired gecko and said that it was time to drag the frog's body into the hole. The gecko immediately started dragging it. After putting it in the hole and covering it with ground, he jumped on it a little to trample the soil. Sniffing the air and noting that the smell of blood was gone, so the predators had no reason to come here anymore, he wondered why he, being a plant, could smell the odors. As he began to absorb water, sunlight and nutrients again, he noted that nothing had changed yet. However, he realized that he had rushed things, as the microorganisms needed time to decompose the frog's body. Accepting that this method was not as fast as absorbing it directly, he remembered the 3 chests he had been able to obtain earlier that he had not yet opened. Calling the system spirit, he told him that he would like to open them. The system spirit immediately appeared and told him that since there were 3 chests, he had given them their serial numbers and asked which one he wanted to open first. Turning to the gecko, the protagonist asked him which one he would like to open. He told him to just name a number between 1 and 3. To which the gecko extended his paw and showed the number 2. Hearing this, Wu Sun told Ruhua to open the second treasure chest. As soon as the chest was opened, the system spirit immediately congratulated his master for obtaining a B-level plant gene called spikes. It was a very good gene that he could also integrate into his vines. Patting the satisfied gecko on the head, Wu Sun said that the one was indeed the best. Wanting to quickly test his new skills, he told Ruhua to apply the fusion. In the next instant, his vines were covered with thorns, which combined with his fighting stance looked very intimidating. The system window said that the thorn gene made his vines thicker, longer, and stronger, and they were covered in sharp thorns. The note jokingly reported that he was now a rose with thorns. Looking at his vines with a villainous smile, he said that now he finally had real lightning whips. Deciding to test their power, he immediately started swinging them at great speed, hitting the leaves, which immediately created holes. The result was beyond his expectations, as it was powerful enough to even seriously injure the horned toad. He decided not to stop, and asked his yellow friend to choose one of the remaining numbers, to which he replied number 3. The remaining chests only had double the points. Looking at them, Wu Sun said that as expected, the chance of a skill falling out was 33%, adding that the gecko was still better than him, as even though he had opened 10 chests, nothing of value had fallen out. He decided not to dwell on it, but to be happy with what he had already gotten, because with the new gene, broken arrow, and bone, his combat power had increased significantly. Now he just had to wait for the right opportunity to realize it. After a while, the silence was broken by the rustling of the grass, and Wu Sun shouted, telling the gecko to keep running. I guess he was going to do it without his words, because the big horned frog was jumping after him, and he was hardly just playing catch-up with it. However, salvation was at hand, as soon as they got close enough, the protagonist released his spike-covered vines in their direction with lightning speed. Upon reaching the toad, they instantly bound its body, doing further damage to it with the barbed thorns that pierced its skin. Having watched many movies, and knowing that it was better to finish off the enemy for sure, Wu Sun made a controlling strike with it against the ground. After a while, after cutting the frog meat into pieces with the broken arrow, he called his yellow friend to eat. After that they started to enjoy the juicy and nutritious frog meat together. Suddenly something caught the main character's attention, making him look up. As it turned out, it was the system spirit Ruhua, who appeared out of nowhere and joyfully began to congratulate him on receiving the treasure chests, which this time was even more. Hearing this, the protagonist with a smile said finally waited for the opportunity to upgrade his body again. After a while, after eating the last of the meat and making a burp, he declared that he was full. Sitting down with a puffed-up belly, he happily announced that this time he was able to get as many as 5 chests. And since the gecko fighter couldn't fulfill his duty of choosing a chest, he had to do it himself, as a result of which he simply told Ruhua to open the middle one. Shining with a golden light, the chest opened. As it turned out, the reward from the chest this time was a B-level sweet potato gene, which his system spirit immediately congratulated him on. The system window reported that sweet potato roots were divided into 3 forms: fibrous, woody and tuberous. It was also reported that the main function of tuberous roots was to store nutrients and reproduce. After reading this, Wu Sun wondered if he even needed this gene. Turning to the system spirit, he asked what the benefits of this gene were after the fusion. The system spirit immediately began to explain, saying that if he just buried the food scraps in the soil and let them decompose, it would take a long time and was wasteful. The sweet potato gene, on the other hand, allowed the processed food to be stored in the roots. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asked incredulously, what was the use of roots that hid nutrients? Did they really need to be dug up and eaten when hungry? However, Spirit refuted his theory, saying that he directly took nutrients from there, which could allow him to thrive even when food was scarce, as well as treat his injuries and recover quickly. Hearing this, Wu Sun immediately had an image in his mind in which the bottle of recovery potion in his hand was his roots. This made his eyes glisten even more with anticipation, and he immediately impatiently told the spirit to quickly start fusing. In the next second, the protagonist was surrounded by a bright green light, while the system window reported that he had successfully merged with the red potato gene, which allowed him to quickly break down food into nutrients and store them in the roots. The note said that now his mother would no longer have to worry about his malnutrition. However, to his bewilderment and confusion, he did not feel any obvious change. Seeing his confusion, Ruhua told him to try using his mind to manipulate the roots and allow them to store food inside him. Hearing this, Wu Sun stared at the toad. But in the next moment, he did not take his eyes off of it, and as if reading an incantation, he began to mutter words about wanting to store food. A moment later he could feel the roots, which immediately rushed to the top. After breaking through from the ground, they immediately began to braid the frog's body. Seeing this, the protagonist could not help but rejoice that everything worked, and also so quickly. He could clearly feel the root systems wrapping around the food and carrying it to the root for storage. It was incredibly convenient, because now he no longer had to dig holes and worry about someone eating his food or it attracting the attention of others. On a future hunt, he decided to test the restorative effect of the sweet root, which was analogous to a bottle of recovery potion that could be equated to 1 life. And if the root was improved, he would have even more lives, and the probability of him surviving would increase greatly. The opportunity to test the new skill did not have to wait long, because after a while, he was attacked by a large red snake, which immediately rushed at the protagonist. However, he did not plan to lose, and controlling his thorny vines, was able to stop her. However, he didn't stop there. He immediately took advantage of its hiccup, wrapped his vines around it and slammed it to the ground. Realizing that the snake was still alive, Wu Sun used his secret technique called the enraged killer gecko that killed exclusively with bones. At a tremendous speed, he forcefully thrust the bone into the body of the immobilized snake. After a while, the dust that was raised during the fight began to disperse. On the ground, the dead snake was still twitching in its death convulsions. While Wu Sun praised his yellow friend and said that they made a great team. Then turning his gaze to his vines, which had snake bite marks, he noted that even though the snake was poisonous, it was not a problem for him. The next moment his root glowed with a bright green light, indicating that healing had begun. A few seconds later, after inspecting his vine from which any wounds had disappeared, he proudly noted that his root healing ability was very good. However, nothing could be more important than dinner, which they happily picked up their improvised cutlery and immediately began to eat. While they were enjoying the snake meat, dark clouds covered the sky and rain began to fall. Ruhwa sitting on the chest hid under an umbrella, while the protagonist along with the gecko were without shelter. But Wu Sun immediately remedied this by weaving his vines into a canopy to protect him and his yellow friend from the rain. Looking at the contented gecko, who was sleeping peacefully and snuggled up to him, he said to himself that he felt more and more attached to his territory, for here he now had food, drink, and a cute little pet. For a moment, he said dreamily, the only thing he was missing was a girl. However, a premonition of impending danger brought him to his senses, and he looked perplexedly ahead of him. As it turned out, there was an amorous system spirit flying straight toward him, who spread his arms and asked if he was his girlfriend. However, a few barbed balls thrown at him quickly remedied the situation. Having fought off the attack of Ruhwa, who was now lying knocked out, the protagonist wondered if he should look for a large female flower if he wanted to find a girl. However, the image that appeared in his head did not particularly please him, so he decided to leave it for later. It's been over a month since our protagonist turned into a flower. During this time, he managed to grow another spiky vine, as well as 2 more roots, which equaled 2 more bottles of healing potion. Throwing the spiky ball into the air and catching it again, Wu Sun boredly wondered why his yellow friend hadn't returned from the hunt yet. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves behind him caught his attention. Turning around, he wondered if the gecko had finally returned from hunting. But what he saw made him freeze in shock. There was a man standing there with a backpack on his back and a hiking bag hanging from his shoulder. While the man was looking around, Wu Sun couldn't be happy that there were also people in this world. In an attempt to attract attention, he immediately started waving leaves and shouting happily, saying that he had finally met some of them. But the next moment he realized that he was just a strange flower with a big mouth, and that the only thing he had in common with humans was the ability to think and speak. So first he decided to say hello and connect. Since he didn't know much about this world, he was going to ask the man a lot of questions. He immediately started yelling loudly. However, without noticing the protagonist, the man passed by. Watching the man bending over the ground, Wu Sun was puzzled as to why he didn't notice him, and whether it was because he was small. But what interested him even more was what he was doing now. Suddenly there was the sound of roots being pulled from the ground. With a smile that seemed devilish to the protagonist, the man happily said that he didn't expect there to be such a precious toxin-cleansing plant. This scene before the protagonist made him realize 2 things, first that the man was gathering herbs, and second that attracting attention was the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life.